You ever get the feeling that no matter what size your organization is, you're always facing some kind of risk?
Oh, absolutely. It's like a constant game of chess, trying to anticipate what could go wrong and figure out your next move.
Right. And the thing is, it's not just about avoiding those big, obvious disasters, it's about making smarter choices every step of the way.
hmm
And that's exactly what we're diving into today with this Pritesh Biswas article.
Yeah, this article really breaks down all the different kinds of risks organizations face.
Exactly. And our goal today is to really get a grip on these different categories so you can walk away with a clear understanding of what's out there without getting bogged down in all the technical jargon.
And as Biswas points out, there are real benefits to getting this right. We're talking about making better decisions strategically, improving your tactics, running your operations more smoothly, and staying on the right side of all those compliance rules. It's about making your organization stronger and more resilient no matter what gets thrown your way.
Okay, so Biswas starts off by talking about risk exposure and risk appetite. What exactly do those terms mean in practical terms?
Well, think of risk exposure as a combination of two things: how likely something is to happen and how bad the impact would be if it did.
So it's not just about whether something could happen, but about how much damage it would do if it actually did.
Exactly. You put those two pieces together, the likelihood and the impact, and that gives you the overall level of risk. Now, when you're looking at that level of risk, you need to consider the organization's risk appetite.
So risk appetite, is that like how much risk a company is willing to stomach?
It's kind of like that. Think of it as the guidelines a company sets for itself. They're saying, okay, up to this point, we're comfortable taking on this much risk. Biswas also talks about magnitude, which basically just means the size of the risk event.
So if you had, say, a data breach, the magnitude would be how much data was actually compromised.
Right. And then you have the impact, which is how that breach actually affects the organization.
And Biswas breaks down that impact into four key areas, right? He uses the acronym FIRM.
That's right. Finance, operations, reputation, and market position. So how does the event hit the company's bottom line? Its day-to-day operations, its image in the public eye, and its standing in the marketplace.
Right, so that's the immediate impact, the firm stuff. But Biswas also talks about consequences. What's the difference between those and impact?
Well, the consequences are the broader, longer-term effects on the organization's goals. He uses the acronym STOC for this: strategic, tactical, operational, and compliance goals.
Ah, okay, so the impact might be the immediate hit, like a financial loss from a lawsuit. But the consequences are how that lawsuit affects your long-term plans and strategies.
Precisely. You could have a big financial impact, but if you manage it well, the consequences for your overall goals might be minimal.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, Biswas also makes this interesting distinction between risk appetite and risk attitude. Can you unpack that for us a bit?
Sure. This is where it gets a bit more nuanced. You see, risk appetite is the official written down policy. It's what the company says it's willing to accept in terms of risk.
Okay, so it's like the rule book.
Exactly. But then you have risk attitude, which is more like the company's personality when it comes to risk.
So some companies might be more cautious, trying to avoid risk whenever possible, while others are more gung-ho, willing to roll the dice for a bigger reward.
Exactly. And Biswas points out that it's important to understand both your risk appetite and your risk attitude. Just because you have a conservative risk appetite on paper doesn't mean the company's culture isn't pushing people to take bigger risks.
So you need to know not just what the rules say, but also how people actually behave in the face of risk.
Right. Because if those two things aren't aligned, you could end up taking on risks that don't really fit with your overall goals, and that could lead to some nasty surprises down the line.
Okay, so that's a great foundation. Now let's move on to a specific type of risk that Biswas calls hazard risks. These seem like the more obvious tangible threats.
Right. Yeah, hazard risks are the things that can directly damage your organization. They can lead to disruptions, financial losses, damage to your reputation, all sorts of problems.
And these are often the kinds of things you can get insurance for, right?
That's right. Think of things like workplace accidents, fires, damage to property, defects in your products, stuff like that.
And these days, you also have to factor in all the risks associated with IT systems.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, system failures, cyber attacks, data breaches, those can be just as damaging, if not more so, than a fire in a warehouse.
Right. And Biswas makes this interesting point about how the magnitude of a hazard risk is only part of the story. You also have to look at the impact after you've taken steps to mitigate the risk.
Yeah, he uses the example of a warehouse fire. Imagine a huge fire ripping through a warehouse. That's a big, magnitude event, right? But then you have insurance to cover the financial losses, and you might have a great crisis management team that steps in to handle the situation and keep things running smoothly.
So the actual impact on the business, the lasting damage, is much smaller than the initial fire might suggest.
Exactly. And the same goes for something like a cyber attack. You might have a data breach, but if you have good security protocols in place and you communicate well with your customers, you might be able to minimize the damage to your reputation and keep your business going.
That's a really important point. It's not just about surviving the initial event, it's about how you recover and move forward. And even if you're financially covered for a hazard risk, Biswas points out that there can still be consequences for your broader goals.
Right. A major disruption can throw your strategic plans off track, force you to rethink your tactics, and even cause problems with compliance, especially if you're in a heavily regulated industry. So it's crucial to manage these hazard risks proactively, even if you have insurance.
Now, Biswas also talks about a really interesting aspect of risk identification that goes beyond just focusing on your corporate objectives. He argues that risk can also come from threats to your key dependencies and core processes.
Yeah, this is a crucial point. You see, a lot of risk management focuses on the big picture goals, but Biswas argues that you also need to look at the underlying systems and processes that make your organization tick.
So it's about looking at the foundations, not just the roof.
Exactly. He uses the example of LG's supply chain problems a few years ago. That wasn't necessarily a direct attack on a specific corporate objective, but the failure of that key dependency had a massive ripple effect throughout the entire company.
So a risk to something you rely on can become a risk to your goals, even if the goals themselves are sound.
Precisely. And Biswas suggests asking yourself not just what could stop us from achieving our goals, but also what could disrupt the things we need to do to function and meet the expectations of our stakeholders.
It's like taking a wider view, looking at the whole ecosystem your organization operates in, right?
Right. And he even points out that during the financial crisis, some banks were so focused on aggressive growth that they overlooked the risks within their core lending operations.
So they were looking at the destination, but not paying attention to the road they were taking to get there.
And that can be a recipe for disaster. Biswas suggests looking at risks related to your key dependencies and using a SWOT analysis to get a more comprehensive view of your vulnerabilities.
SWOT, that's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, right?
Exactly. It's a great way to get a more holistic understanding of where your risks might be hiding.
Okay, that's a lot to think about. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that might seem a bit counterintuitive,
Hmm.
the rewards of taking risks. Because it's not always about avoiding risk, is it?
Not at all. Biswas makes it clear that sometimes you have to take risks to achieve something great. And this is particularly true when we talk about opportunity risks.
Opportunity risks. So that's like when you launch a new product, knowing there's a chance it could flop, but hoping it'll be a huge success.
Exactly. And Biswas emphasizes that you have to understand the potential downsides, make sure the risk is within your tolerance level, and have the resources to handle any negative outcomes. It's about taking calculated risks, not just jumping into the deep end blindly.
So it's not about being reckless, it's about being strategic with your risk taking.
Right. And he talks about how this risk-reward balance can shift as a business grows and evolves. A startup might be willing to take on more risk for the chance of rapid growth, while a mature company might prioritize stability and avoid any major upheavals.
That makes a lot of sense. Your approach to risk should probably change depending on where you are in your business life cycle.
Absolutely. And Biswas points out that the rewards you're seeking aren't always just financial. You might be taking a risk to improve your operations, streamline your processes, or even just maintain your compliance with regulations.
So the reward could be anything that helps your organization achieve its goals, whether it's making more money, running more efficiently, or simply staying in business.
Exactly. It's all about understanding what you're trying to achieve and what level of risk you're willing to take on to get there.
Okay, so now Biswas circles back to the idea of risk attitude and delves into it a bit deeper. He points out that different organizations have different inherent views on risk, shaped by things like the industry they're in, their market position, and even the personalities of their leaders.
Right. And it's important to remember that distinction between risk attitude, which is that long-term, almost philosophical view on risk, and risk appetite, which is the more immediate, situation-specific willingness to take on a particular risk.
So your attitude is your general outlook, and your appetite is how hungry you are for risk in a given moment.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And Biswas links this back to the business life cycle, saying that a brand new startup might have a very different risk attitude than a well-established company.
Because a startup might be more focused on growth and disruption, while a mature company might be more concerned with stability and protecting its existing market share.
Precisely. And understanding your organization's fundamental risk attitude is key to setting a risk appetite that actually makes sense for your situation.
It's about aligning your actions with your underlying beliefs about risk.
Okay, now we're getting into some more technical territory. Biswas talks about risk triggers and introduces the concept of the bow tie diagram.
Yeah, this is where things get a bit more visual. He defines risk in a more technical way as the uncertainty of outcomes. And he specifically connects this to managing control risks in projects.
Control risks.
Yeah, like let's say you're working on a construction project and you don't know exactly what the ground conditions are going to be like until you start digging. That's a control risk because it introduces uncertainty into your plans.
Because you don't know if you're going to hit solid rock or a swamp.
Exactly. And that uncertainty means you could end up finishing the project ahead of schedule and under budget, or you could run into delays and cost overruns. It all depends on what you find when you start digging. So it's not just about potential negative events, it's about the inherent variability in how things might turn out.
Right. And Biswas says that organizations often try to manage this variability within a certain tolerance. They're saying, okay, we're comfortable with outcomes falling within this range, but anything outside of that range is a problem.
So they're setting boundaries for how much uncertainty they're willing to accept.
Exactly. And that brings us to the bow tie diagram, which is a visual tool for representing risk. Imagine a bow tie. On the left side, you have the sources of the risk, which Biswas groups using that SDOC framework we talked about earlier: strategic, tactical, operational, and compliance.
And on the right side of the bow tie.
You have the potential impacts of the risk, using the firm framework: financial, infrastructure, reputational, and marketplace. And right in the middle, at the knot of the bow tie, is the risk event itself, the thing that actually happens.
So it's like a visual map of how a risk can unfold, from its root causes to its potential consequences.
Exactly. And the bow tie diagram also shows where your preventative controls are, the things you do to try to stop the risk from happening in the first place, and your recovery measures, what you do after the risk event has occurred.
So it's a really comprehensive way to visualize and understand a specific risk.
Absolutely. And Biswas points out that you can even use the bow tie diagram to represent opportunities, not just threats.
So it's a versatile tool for thinking about risk and uncertainty in a structured way.
Precisely. Okay, now let's move on to risk classification. Biswas says there are different ways to categorize risks, and he starts by talking about hazard risks.
Hazard risks, right? The things that can cause direct damage to your organization.
Yeah, and he suggests you can categorize them based on what they affect, like your property, your people, or your overall business continuity.
So are you talking about things like a fire damaging a building, an employee getting injured on the job, or a cyber attack shutting down your entire operation?
Exactly. And he also talks about classifying risks based on their time frame, whether they're long-term, medium-term, or short-term risks.
So a long-term risk might be something like a shift in consumer behavior that gradually erodes your market share, while a short-term risk might be a sudden power outage that disrupts your operations for a few hours.
Precisely. And thinking about the time frame of a risk can help you prioritize your risk management efforts.
Because you might need to respond very differently to a sudden crisis than you would to a gradual, long-term trend.
Right. And Biswas also highlights the importance of identifying risk triggers, those specific events that could set off a chain reaction leading to a major problem.
So it's about spotting the warning signs early on so you can take steps to prevent a small problem from snowballing into a major disaster.
Exactly. Now, Biswas then lays out 4 key risk categories that he wants us to focus on: compliance risks, hazard risks, control risks, and opportunity risks.
Okay, those sound familiar. Let's break those down one by one.
Sure, compliance risks are all about following the rules, whether it's laws, regulations, industry standards, or even your own internal policies.
And the goal here is to avoid these risks altogether, right? You don't want to be breaking the law or violating regulations.
Exactly. You want to be squeaky clean when it comes to compliance. Then you have hazard risks, which we've already talked about quite a bit.
Right, those are the threats that can cause direct damage, things like fires, accidents, cyber attacks, that kind of stuff.
And with hazard risks, the focus is on prevention, minimizing damage, and having plans for recovery. You might be able to tolerate some level of hazard risk, especially if you have insurance, but you want to keep those risks as low as possible.
Okay, what about control risks?
Control risks are all about the uncertainty in achieving your objectives. They often relate to things like internal financial controls or how you manage projects.
So it's about making sure your internal systems are working properly and that you're executing your plans effectively.
Right. And Biswas points out that while control risks are important to manage, being too rigid or risk averse can actually stifle innovation and creativity.
So you need to find a balance between control and flexibility.
Exactly. And finally, we have opportunity risks, which are the risks you take intentionally in pursuit of greater rewards.
So this is when you decide to launch a new product, expand into a new market, or make a major investment knowing there's a chance it could fail, but believing the potential payoff is worth the risk.
Exactly. And with opportunity risks, the focus is on maximizing the potential upside while managing the potential downsides. You're taking a calculated gamble, but you're doing it with your eyes wide open.
Okay, those four categories really give you a comprehensive framework for thinking about all the different types of risks an organization might face.
They really do. And to make these categories even more concrete, Biswas gives us some examples of how they might play out in an oil company.
Let's hear those examples. I think that will really help bring these concepts to life.
Sure. For an oil company, compliance risks would include things like environmental regulations, health and safety rules, and the permits they need to drill.
So they need to make sure they're operating within the law and meeting all the regulatory requirements.
Exactly. Then you have hazard risks, which for an oil company could include things like oil spills, explosions, fires, equipment failures, and even natural disasters.
Those are some pretty serious risks.
They are. And the oil industry is constantly working to prevent these events, minimize their impact, and have plans in place for recovery. Then you have control risks, which for an oil company might involve delays in their exploration projects, problems getting new drilling operations up and running, or disruptions in the refining process.
So these are risks that are internal to the company, related to how they manage their projects and processes.
Exactly. And then you have opportunity risks, which for an oil company might involve things like investing in new drilling sites, exploring renewable energy sources, or expanding into new geographic markets.
So those are risks they're taking in hopes of growing their business and increasing their profits.
Right. And these examples really illustrate how those four risk categories can apply to a real-world industry.
It's one thing to talk about these concepts in the abstract, but seeing them applied to a specific industry makes them much more tangible and understandable.
I agree. I think those examples really help to ground the theory in reality.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Pritesh Biswas's framework for understanding risk types, what's the one key takeaway you'd want our listeners to remember?
I'd say the most important thing is to recognize that there are different types of risk, and each type requires a different approach to management.
So you can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach to risk management.
Exactly. You need to understand the specific risks your organization faces, whether they're compliance risks, hazard risks, control risks, or opportunity risks, and then develop tailored strategies for managing each type.
And by doing that, you can make your organization more resilient, more adaptable, and ultimately more successful.
Absolutely. It's all about making informed choices, understanding your risk appetite, and having a clear plan for dealing with the uncertainties that inevitably come your way.
That's a great note to end on. And to our listeners, as you think about your own work and the organizations you're involved with, I'd encourage you to ask yourself which of these risk categories might be the most critical for you to focus on. And how can you use this knowledge to make better decisions, improve your operations, and build a more resilient future?
I think that's a really important question for everyone to consider. It's not just about avoiding risk, it's about understanding it, managing it, and even embracing it when it makes sense.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we look forward to exploring more fascinating topics with you in the future.
Thanks for having me.